This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. The field of international development and humanitarian aid is so broad and diverse that it's essentially impossible to keep up with everything that's going on. Combine that with the rapid pace of technology development, communications, and all things internet, and you wouldn't be alone if you felt a bit overwhelmed by it all. The good news is that there are a growing number of forums, groups, and conferences that interested professionals can tap into to dive deeper into their area of interest, connect with others of a like mind, or, perhaps most importantly, take time to look up from their desk to see how the rest of the universe is out there trying to help those in need. My guest today on the 112th episode of the Terms of Reference podcast is Dr. Silvia Hostettler, and she spends a good deal of her time convening spaces where development and humanitarian professionals can interact. She is the Deputy Director of the Cooperation and Development Center, or CODEV, at EPFL in Switzerland, where she is responsible for coordinating research activities and for the UNESCO Chair in Technologies for Development, who, incidentally, are also responsible for hosting the biannual Tech for Dev conference in Lausanne. Silvia is also in charge of the educational program offered by CODEV and gives lectures in the field of development cooperation, in particular on the potential of technologies and innovation in the global south. I spoke with Silvia in Lausanne. Hello, Silvia. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
It's my pleasure, Stephen.
Silvia, tell me, we're recording this at the sort of beginning of June in 2016. Where are you sitting today? Where do we find you?
So I'm sitting in my office at the EPFL campus, which is located by the Lake Léman, Lake of Geneva. And it's a beautiful day.
Beautiful day, summertime, and starting to get hot, finally.
It does. It's a great day. Very nice.
Excellent. That's the best time to be an academic, right? I guess. Recently, in actually a matter of weeks ago, you were the chair of the UNESCO Chair in Technologies for Development Conference. And the subtitle of that conference this year was From Innovation to Social Impact. I think that you couldn't have a more sweet spot as to what we want to talk about on this podcast regarding innovation and humanitarian aid, or innovation and the international development world. Why don't you give us an overview of what that conference was about this year, and maybe pick a couple of the topics that you thought were the most interesting?
Okay, yeah. So this conference takes place every 2 years. It's one of our flagship products of the Chair in Technologies for Development. And it brings together around 400 people from 65 countries talking about what Technologies for Development can do. The areas we are looking at are ICT for development, urban development, renewable energy, disaster risk reduction, medical technologies, and humanitarian action. And every second year, we choose a special topic to focus on. So 2 years ago, we looked at, what is essential? And this year, we were thinking, well, you hear so much about innovation. There's so many challenges that we are facing today in the development space. And I find that we are increasingly turning towards innovation. And there's a mountain of innovation, but things are not changing quickly enough. So we thought, okay, let's focus on the crucial step. How do we get from innovation to social impact, to an actual change in the field that makes basically the world a better place?
I caught on to the one sentence that you said there, that things are not changing quickly enough. Dive into that a little bit more. What does that mean to you? Because perhaps to some people, we've got mobile phones in the field, we've got smartphones, we've got technology being implemented, in every corner of the world. We have, new ways of implementing. We've got tons and tons of data coming back. But there's still a general sense from participants, maybe from where you sit as the chair, that things are still kind of the same?
Okay, if we look at the world today, there are still 2 billion people who live with less than $3 a day, and you have still significant levels of poverty, inequalities are rising. And even though, I think last year was really an amazing year, 2015, with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in New York. We had the globally binding climate agreement that came through, and the first global framework in disaster risk reduction. So it has been a groundbreaking year in terms of agreements that have been reached at the global level. But these agreements they exist only on paper. And what we now have to look at, how do we translate these commitments into actual change on the ground? And if we look at innovation, even though innovation has been going on, it has not led to as much impact as it could have. And we do have access to new technologies. As you said, mobile technologies opens a huge range of new possibilities in the field of mobile banking or mHealth, etc. But what we feel here is that the chain that goes from the first innovation attempts to the actual impact in the field, that's where so many things go wrong along the way. Because if you think about first brainstorming or thinking of new ways, new processes, new methods, and new technology, you might come up with a great prototype, but then you will have to find solutions of how can you find the industrial partner to manufacture it? How are you going to establish a supply chain? How are you going to upscale that technology so that it reaches all the intended beneficiaries? And then you have to make sure that these intended beneficiaries actually adopt the technology. And if they adopt it, then you have to go back and measure the impact of the adoption of that technology in the field. Did it really lead to attaining the objective that you set yourself when you started innovating in the first place? So there's so many different parts that go from the initial innovation development to the upscaling to measuring the development impact. That is very complex and complicated. And I think so far, we are far away from leading every promising innovation to the actual impact in the field.
You have just put so much on the table. It's fantastic. Did anything come out of the conference in particular? Was there any insights or any consensus that was brought about through these, I guess you had mentioned 5 or 6 different threads about how that innovation process can either be condensed or streamlined or configured in a way that, the process you just described, gosh, it seems like, holy smokes, there's so many years, so many different gears and things. And as you said, there's so many different points of failure. Anything come out of the conference that we could use as best practice?
I think a few things came out of the conference that are really worth thinking about in the long term. And I think maybe the one key element about technological innovation is coming up with a sustainable financial business model, even if when you start thinking about the technological idea that you have, because you can have the greatest idea and the best prototype and the best intentions. If it's not financially sustainable in the long term, then it's not going to go anywhere. You won't be able to upscale it, and it won't lead to the impact you were aiming for, because it's going to collapse. You're not going to have the funds to keep on going for that. So I think the realization that integrating reflections on the business model right from the beginning is a key element for success. I think that was something that came out very strongly. And the other elements, it's something in the development space we've been talking for quite a long time, but it's important to mention them again and again. We have to really co-develop. We have to develop the technologies. We have to be in the field and talk with the intended users or with our partners in the field, so that technologies actually answer real needs and are not something that we identify sitting in our high-tech labs in the global north, having these great ideas, what would be great technologies for development, without confronting them to the people that are our supposed partners and beneficiaries. That's not working. And we actually know that. I think everybody knows that, but it's so easy to forget. So that was something that came up again and again, to work in partnership, bring the right people together right from the beginning, and, fail early. Don't sit in the north, have your great technological idea, and then think about transferring it to the global south, because that has proven not to work. That's not working. So that came up again, and I think it's good to emphasize it, even though it's sort of like stating the obvious. It is key, and it's easy to forget once we are in our facing our funding constraints and how you develop research proposals and how that goes. It's really important to consider this a condition sine qua non. Your technology is very likely not to be successful, or not as successful as you would like it to be.
I know that there were a couple of speakers from the Global South, obviously. Did anyone come with sort of say, hey, look, we are a lab? You know, we know that UNICEF has innovation labs. We know that there's Evidence Action has labs, you know, around the globe as well. Did anybody come with one of those case studies to say, hey, look, this is how it works and this is why we should do it this way?
Yeah, I mean, there were a few people. There were 75 paper presentations over 3 days. So as I couldn't be everywhere,
so you don't have all of those in your brain. You don't have like this
encyclopedic
memory. Come on.
So, but there was someone, you know, from the IBM research lab in Kenya who was very interested in more maybe in listening than presenting a case study, and there were people coming from Cartagena, Colombia, who were talking about how you push forward urban development in collaboration with the local communities, and what worked and what didn't work, and this sort of key factors, like you have to give this process of co-development much more time. It's much more easy if you do it in your own corner and then you go back and present what you have come up with than if you actually have to, you know, deal with other partners. It makes it more complex, more robust also, but also it takes much more time. So that was something that came up regularly also. It's a long process.
Yeah. Not only the long process, but were there also, or maybe in your opinion, you know, you mentioned ICT for D, urban development, disaster risk reduction, mHealth. Was there still a feeling at the conference of sort of silos within each of those areas, or, you know, is someone from mHealth saying, you know, also talking with someone from urban development to say, hey, look, we see how this works in urban settings, but also in rural settings, or maybe how it can work in disaster risk reduction? Are those lines being formed as well on a regular basis?
Well, maybe it's actually an interesting thing that you put on the table, because that makes me think the way we structure our conference is actually by thematic sessions. There are some transversal sessions, but that doesn't actually encourage the mHealth people talking to the IC people or the medical technology people. So that's something we should maybe think about. So what I found that came up that was touching all the topics was the fact that there was a discussion about, okay, to what extent do we leave the leadership to communities in the field of taking a technological development forward, or to determine how a disaster risk response should look like, or what is part of humanitarian aid, or what they actually need to what extent are we accountable to the communities we intend to serve? Because we are always accountable to our funders, but why are we not accountable to the intended beneficiaries? And that came up independent of the actual technology we were talking about. So I found that was really interesting.
What about, you're speaking specifically from sort of a donor-led, not-for-profit mindset. Were there anybody who presented, or were there any interesting solutions that came from a for-profit perspective that said, you know, we're market-driven, we expect to sell our product or services in a way that, you know, is accessible to the bottom of the pyramid, and that's how they sustain their funding?
Yes, there were a few of these companies. Maybe let me tell you about one of our own projects based here at EPFL.
Excellent.
Which is called Global Diagnostics. So the idea of that project came from the fact that if you look at all the medical equipment that is sent to Africa, you have to see that after 1 year, 70% of that equipment is not being used anymore, either because, you know, spare parts are missing, or nobody knows how to maintain it, or the fluctuation in the electrical current damaged the equipment. So all these exported medical technologies is not appropriate for many countries in the Global South, and in particular in Africa. And so one of our research teams that is led by Dr. Klaus Schönenberger, they focus on how can you redevelop an X-ray machine that is robust, that is appropriate, that is affordable, and that addresses all the potential failures right from the beginning. So they're looking at, you know, how are you going to manufacture it? How are you going to deal with the logistics? Who's going to sell it? Who's going to assemble it? Who's going to control it? Who's going to commission it? Who will train the people who will use it? How do you maintain it? How do you repair it? Up to the very recycling part. And one really interesting insight that project has given us is that, so this takes a long time to develop at the technical level. It involves university hospitals, universities with more applied science expertise. And once you get to the point where you have a functioning X-ray machine that is robust and affordable and works very well and is 10 times cheaper than what you could get in the global south, then all of a sudden you have a product that competes with X-ray machines that are sold in the global north. So that's really interesting, because your business model all of a sudden becomes very
local or regional driven, basically.
Exactly. So that was something that we found extremely interesting, and that is something that other, especially medical technology organizations or small companies or startups are facing.
There could be a conflict of interest there when we talk about, a donor-led initiative, let's just say from the EU or from the United States, providing funds to develop new technologies, et cetera. But then you're talking about a locally driven sourcing process, manufacturing, repair. And then suddenly you're seeing your donors saying, hey, wait, we give you money. We want American jobs. We want American manufacturers, these kinds of things. Is that part of the conversation? Do you feel that tension?
Well, we're not based in the States.
Sure, you're not, but maybe the EU.
Yeah, no, we're not part of the EU, Switzerland. So, but don't tell anybody.
Oh, sorry. Boy, I just flubbed two things in the same sentence. Sorry about that.
No, but for instance, we didn't get any funds from the Swiss Development Corporation. That sort of discussion of having to create jobs in Switzerland in exchange for these funds, that's not really happening here. But what we found was that it was difficult to get an industrial partner that would be willing to produce such an X-ray machine in the global north, because it will compete with its own much higher priced products by basically providing the same sort of functionalities. That has been a huge problem. So what we are looking now is to really, move the whole development process and the startup and base it in the global south, in a country like South Africa, for instance.
I'd like to sort of change the direction where we're going right now for just a little bit. And one of the categories that you spoke about for the conference was humanitarian action, which in my mind is a sector of work in itself, whereas the other pieces of the conference were sort of silos within the development sector, right? Do you see the lines, or do you see were conversations happening where the lines between humanitarian aid and development are being blurred? Do you feel like there's a different innovation process for humanitarian action as there are for development? Or maybe just sort of speak about that juxtaposition for a minute.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So maybe there's a few things to say about that. What we have seen is that the line indeed between humanitarian aid and development aid is becoming increasingly blurred, because conflicts have a tendency to last very many years, so that humanitarian action actually starts turning into development projects, development aid. And what has happened here at EPFL, and what I think is really a very innovative partnership, is that last year ICRC, so the International Committee of the Red Cross, and EPFL decided to join forces, so to bring together the technological expertise of EPFL and the humanitarian expertise of the ICRC, and fund an innovation hub, which is based at our unit here at EPFL, and it's called the Humanitarian Tech Hub. So that's very innovative for ICRC, who is a big organization. It's very visible. It has an important role, and in that innovation space here at EPFL, they bring concrete challenges from the field that their operational staff is facing, and put it on the table here at EPFL and also to other stakeholders within Switzerland and say, okay, can you help us find a solution, for instance, in developing a new prosthetic foot? Because the one we have, it only moves in one way, up or down, but we have to demand from our beneficiaries that they would like a foot that is more flexible and that also looks a little bit different and is made of more comfortable material. So here at EPFL, we can pull together different labs, sort of the material science labs, and try to come up with a better solution. So that's one project. There's another one that focuses on one of the big challenges in humanitarian aid is when you have a conflict in an urban environment, essential services such as hospitals or water pumping stations that are connected to the grid. Well, the grid gets shut down and they don't have any longer access to electricity. So they are thinking, how can we develop systems that we can basically, to put it very simply, that we can switch on when conflict protracts. That gives us enough power to run hospitals and water pumping stations, at least these two, in urban contexts over many years. And this sounds easy, but it's actually very complicated. So these are two more challenges that they are putting out there and say, well, innovate, let us know what you can come up with.
Do you feel that, is there good conversation going on between the sort of the more standard development people and the, let's say, for instance, ICRC or OCHA or other humanitarian actors, where so often we find, there's that line in the sand where they say, no, your development, we're working humanitarian, but is this lab a place where they can talk and connect and sort of share with one another as well?
Well, I guess I can only talk for us, our team here and for EPFL, and I didn't see that. I didn't see that at all. Even though it might sound quite idealistic, I think what we all care about is to have a real impact in the field, to change things for the better, to find sustainable solutions that actually work. And so it doesn't matter that much if you come from the humanitarian aid field or if you come from the development field or if you're more, an engineer. It's basically you look at the problem that's on the table and you try to find a solution to address that problem. So no, Personally, I didn't feel the politics being involved in this sort of partnership. No.
Okay. You've had the privilege, you said this conference is every 2 years. What's the biggest disruption or biggest innovation that or maybe we could just call it the evolution that you've seen over maybe the past 6 or 8 or 10 years in this field that you think has really made a difference and is really shaping the future?
Okay, so what I think is very exciting is based on, mobile technology, which is not surprising. Today, you have about 75 to 80% of the world population who have access to mobile phones, and this opens so many possibilities to bring development forward. If we look just at the health, at health systems or access to functioning health services, health is connected to the environment, it's connected to poverty, it's connected to population growth. So through mHealth, there are so many new projects that are possible now that were not possible 10 years ago. Maybe to make it very tangible, there are projects I'm sure you're aware of also where women living in very rural areas that are pregnant can be accompanied through their pregnancy through SMS messages that tell them, well, did you think about the birth plan? Did you identify the next clinic? How are you going to get there? Please remember to come in for your 4-month check. Please remember to take your vitamins. This makes a huge difference. This can save lives of the mother, of the infant. If you have new opportunities to use telemedicine and be able to detect the pneumonia of children from a well-qualified medical staff, but far away because you're able to use telemedicine or biosensors integrated in smartphones. This opens huge possibilities, and I think we're very far away from having exploited all of those. And if you look at the banking sector, how can rural communities access banking and financial services? Well, through mobile phones like the M-Pesa program in Kenya, they're able to open accounts, they are able to access financial credit, launch a small company. That was not possible 10 to 20 years ago. Or let's look at farmer communities who before just sold their harvest at any price that was given to them by middlemen. Well, by accessing market prices, they have a higher negotiation power and obtain a fair price for the products. So I think that's one area where I feel that there's a huge potential, and it's really exciting. One of our own projects that I think is a really neat project. It's called Info for Dourou, and it's a precision agriculture project based on ICT in Burkina Faso, where basically you use wireless sensor networks to detect the humidity level in the soil, and that's then optimized for the plant that you're cultivating. Let's say it's onions, and whenever these onions are experiencing drought, then a text message is sent to the mobile phone of the farmers, alerting them, well, you need to irrigate now. And when the soil is saturated, there's another text message that says, well, now you have irrigated enough and you can stop. And we have conducted that project over the last 5 years, and we have seen that farmers were able to save up to 30% of water, and they have increased their harvest by 25%.
That's huge numbers. Wow.
I mean, it makes a huge difference in countries like Burkina Faso that are so dry, and everything involving further development involves having more water. So with 30% water saved, they can do something else and increase their income. So I think this, high-tech technology being used in a very low-resource context, it's really exciting. And maybe the last thing that I find exciting and where we had a strong representation in the last conference was the 3D printing possibilities. So we had an organization come that maybe you've heard of. It's called Field Ready in Haiti, that are printing medical devices on demand or, after natural disasters in countries like Haiti or Nepal or even the US, where when everything else breaks down, you have portable 3D printers and you can print syringes or IV hooks or umbilical cord clamps or even in, refugee crisis, you can print buckets or forks or plates. So I think the 3D printing technology that has emerged quite recently, it's actually a technology that fab labs in the global south are using at the same time as they are making progress in the global north. So there has been a fab lab in Togo, in Lomé. It's called the WAFAB 3D printer, I think, that's made out of electronic recycled parts. And I think this sort of innovation, coming out of these fab labs in Africa, it's really exciting. This is something that hasn't existed 10 years ago. So that's very promising.
Those are all super fantastic examples. I really appreciate that. What about some of the hurdles? You have all of this excitement going on, but are we still facing the same kind of hurdles of, where do we get the funding from? Or are there policy hurdles? Or one question that I think you particularly might be in a great position to answer is, are there enough human resources to meet the demands of these innovations?
Well, I think that's a big question you put out there. I see that two levels. I feel there's a lot of dedicated people in the humanitarian development space, innovation space, fab labs, hacker space, who are great and who come up with really interesting ideas. On the other hand, due to the global, economic situation, which is not great, there is objectively less funding available. But I would also say, even though I might again, appear to be overly idealistic, if you have less money, you have to be even more innovative, right? You have to do more with less money. So that might also drive us to find new solutions. And then the other level where I think, which is connected and which I think the big leverage points are, it's the, unfair trade agreements at the global level, illegal financial flows, which we as engineers cannot influence directly. But this is where the big leverage points are, where we could make big changes. But this requires a political commitment at the global level. And there, the funding would be redirected. You would allocate more funding to development and less to the army, etc. So I think that there's a lot to be done. You'd have to think about different global development models, different economic systems, just rethink the world and put the priorities towards sustainability, because this is where the big challenges lie, the, climatic sustainability, the socioeconomic sustainability. I mean, here in Europe, with the ongoing refugee crisis, we're directly confronted with the fact that the world is it's not going in the right direction. So that really needs to change.
In a conference such as this, the energy is placed on innovation. It's placed on where are we, what new things are out there? How are things coming together? What's the future look like? Something I'm always fascinated by is how things move from being a pilot / innovation / new idea to something that either the company, organization, or sector itself considers a standard. Was there any discussion of that, or have you considered that at your university?
Well, maybe let me just tell you about a new, really exciting trend in educating engineers today. So what we found is that engineers at top universities in the world, such as ours, such as MIT, such as Berkeley, Columbia, etc., they're very good in their disciplinary field, but if they are interested in or they are located in the global south, they have quite a few skills that they are lacking. And what we can see with our partner organizations is that there is a real need to offer more appropriate training and to actually to launch a new scientific degree in the new field that's called development engineering. And UC Berkeley is a leader in that field and is offering now a new doctoral level program in development engineering, which basically intends to train engineers in order to come up with creative solutions that help human development in low resource contexts and that are upscalable to have a large positive impact. So I think right now, this new trend, it's really innovative. It's difficult also to some extent because this is threatening to some of the more disciplinary thinking labs, professors, deans. But this is something that goes in a direction that we think will have a much stronger impact in terms of training engineers to become facilitators of sustainable development. And even though right now we are in the beginning, I think that more and more universities will pick that up and will integrate that sort of training programs into their curricula. And MIT is already doing it. It's called Global Engineering. UC Berkeley has done it. We are in the process of launching it. And what was very clever of the UC Berkeley team is that they founded a new journal called Development Engineering as well, where you can publish the research that you have done in the Global South in a peer-reviewed, highly rated journal in the future. So that gives you academic credibility doing that. And it's not just your on-the-side activity that you can't really publish in the more disciplinary traditional journals. So I think that's a very nice, innovative trend at the educational level that we can observe. And that was intensely discussed at the last UNESCO conference.
You went somewhere with that answer that I had no idea, but that's a fantastic new development. Thanks for sharing that. I have only a couple more questions for you, but one of them is one that I did not expect to ask, but one that has been in the back of my mind since we first started talking, which is why UNESCO? You know, when I think of UNESCO, I think of saving monuments and, preserving education, these kinds of things. How did they get involved in the development for technology field or funding a chair of it?
Okay, well, you would have to ask that UNESCO, actually. I don't know how they got to this idea, but that UNESCO has a very large mandate, right? UNESCO, science, and they're very well known for the World Heritage Sites program. That's probably what they're best known for, but they also have a mandate for water and science. So what their idea was in the origin, I think, is to give as an academic institution, you can submit a proposal to become a UNESCO chair in a certain field. And after quite a long and extensive process of negotiating and approving it, you are then given the right to be known as a UNESCO chair, and ours is in technologies for development. And what's happening now, what's really the cool thing about this is that UNESCO in Paris is making a significant effort in encouraging networking activities among the different chairs. So we, for instance, we are working closely with Mark Tolsnik from Technion University in Israel, who has a UNESCO chair in engineering for sustainable communities. So very similar. And we're talking about, joint summer schools or joint research projects. There's another chair in engineering for human and sustainable development at the University of Trento. And we're working together on publishing a special issue on energy-related fields. There's going to be a new chair at Amrita University in India on gender equality. So we're supporting that chair. There's another chair in Africa who just asked us for a support letter. So each new chair has to show a support letter from another UNESCO chair that says, it's a great idea that this university will have a chair in this thematic. We sort of vouch for them. And so that's really a great way of forming a global network of UNESCO chairs. And it doesn't matter that much if they're called UNESCO chairs or not. They're just chairs with joint interests and similar agenda that have been facilitated to work together through UNESCO. And I think, just for that idea, it's something that has brought a lot of value to us. And it's also, I would say, visibility. It has a sort of a convening power. It means if you're a UNESCO chair, you probably know more or less what you're doing, basically.
Awesome. Look at that. It was a much more detailed answer than even I expected. That's incredible. And thanks for letting us know about the other chairs around the world, because that sounds like a very powerful network to tap into. Speaking of which, my second to last question is, who do you pay attention to? I mean, you're lucky enough to be the organizer of a fairly large conference, so you have a huge ecosystem that you can look at. Are there one or two individuals or organizations, maybe blogs or podcasts or publications that you regularly go to sort of keep up to date or look for new ideas?
Sure, yeah. Let me maybe come first to one that's very close to my heart. So what I think, being in the development space, one of the development angles that do not get enough attention and that would have a huge potential is the fact that we have to find a way to leverage the development potential of women. Like talking about the challenges that humanity is facing today, it is really crucial that 50% of the world population has a say and can contribute with their energy and competence and ideas to solve these challenges. And we're so far away from having, women participate in these discussions. And so I think there's a lot of innovation needed in that space. And one thing, or let's say one campaign I am following very closely because I think it's innovative, it's attractive, I think it has impact. It's the He for She campaign by UN Women, where they are using, the 10 CEOs, such as the one from Unilever or Twitter, 10 heads of state, 10 heads of universities, such as Oxford University. So big names, men who are champions for women's rights, which sort of goes away from the space where we're talking about women's rights and equality, and largely or unfortunately mostly ignored by what's happening in the world. So I think that's very innovative, the way they do that. So I follow that closely. Another network that I follow closely, it's the SwissNext network, of which I was part of before. And for instance, SwissNext San Francisco, they have a website called Next Trends. They look at innovations, they scope what's happening in the Silicon Valley, and that's a really fascinating network to follow. And I was saying before, what I think is really fascinating is all the innovation coming out of the global south. The Fab Labs based in South Africa and Kenya and Senegal, the impact hubs there's 91 all over the world. It's a really exciting network. And I think we will be confronted more and more with innovation flows that come from the global south, that come to the global north, and vice versa, and south-south cooperation. So this is something where I think the most exciting trends are coming from right now.
Last question, and I know you've already given us a ton of examples over the last 45 minutes here, but is there one innovation, either in the labs that you're working in there, or something that you're following that you just think is super awesome, you want to geek out about it, and you want to make sure everybody knows about?
I guess I have to go back to the 3D printing. Even though I've talked about it before, and I know that there's a lot of critique that's addressed also to 3D printing, but I think just the way it's mobile, if you use solar power, you can even take it to the field, and you can actually fabricate what you need. It goes from prosthetics, to utensils you need in a refugee camp, to medical equipment. You can actually print what you need in the field at the time that you need it, in the quantity that you need it, for a price that is affordable for the population. And you can train local teams how to do this. Designs are open access. So I think this is, agile, it's innovative, it's flexible. That I think is very exciting. I think there's a lot of possibilities out there in the field of 3D printing.
Silvia, thank you so very much for taking the time to be on the show today. I've really appreciated your insights.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much, Stephen, for having me.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.